Chapter 101. How dare he speak like that? The reaction was intense. Chung Myung clenched his teeth. While he was still reeling from the shocking defeat, Yoonjung took the initiative to demand the next battle. Such a cheeky request made Chung Myung's blood boil. On the other hand, Yoonjung recoiled when he saw the fiery reaction on the Jeongnam side. Did I overdo it? Although it was an event where they had to fight, it was natural that they'd react poorly after such apparent provocation. However, this was something Yoonjung had to do. He had to continue carrying the momentum started by Chung Myung. Chung Myung shouted with an angry voice, "Gongjin! Gongjin! Yes, Sasuk! Go! Smash that cocky bastard and hurry back! Yes!" Chung Myung's face was distorted. He was a perfectionist. He desired a complete and total victory over Mount Hua, but now that perfect flow had been broken. It was a crack that would be impossible to fill. Chung Myung. His eyes turned to Chung Myung in the distance. This idiot. Chung Myung didn't expect Sun Woo-ryang to suffer such a devastating defeat. Was their disciple weaker than expected? Or was Chung Myung that much stronger than anticipated? The latter. It was impossible for Chung Myung to misinterpret Sun Woo-ryang's capabilities. He was undoubtedly the most powerful among the third-class disciples. For him to be defeated by Chung Myung meant that he was much stronger than Jeongnam Sect's third-class disciples. It's possible, but the other disciples aren't that strong. It was an unexpected blow, but he wasn't disgraced yet. If the remaining disciples could claim victory and retake the momentum, the conference would end with Chung Myung being the only remarkable thing about Mount Hua. Gongjin, one of the strongest of the third-class disciples, took to the stage and drew his wooden sword. With that, Yoonjung took a deep breath. Is he my opponent again? This was actually sooner than Yoonjung expected. Yoonjung battled Gongjin in the last conference as well. Back then, he was pushed back and crushed without even being able to counterattack. Now, 2 years later, honestly, I have no chance of winning. If it hadn't been for Chung Myung's arrival. Before Chung Myung joined the sect, Yoonjung never properly trained. To be precise, he trained out of obligation. He never trained with the desire to improve himself and grow powerful, because it all felt meaningless. A lethargic air permeated Mount Hua and corrupted the disciples. The impact of their previous defeat at the Jeongnam Sect's hands was just that great. Baekchun was the only one who challenged that wall of despair. But then, one day, Chung Myung appeared as if he was a star that dropped from the sky. Thanks to him, Yoonjung was able to spend the past few months doing his best. Could the gap have narrowed with just a couple months of training? Yoonjung couldn't be sure, but I won't lose so easily. He is the great Sahyung of the third-class disciples. Even if Chung Myung was truly the one in charge of the third-class disciples, Yoonjung still had his pride as the great Sahyung. He refused to give an unseemly performance here. Gongjin fiercely glared at Yoonjung. No need for words. I'll make you painfully aware of how deeply I care about victory. I have no intention of saying anything either. Words are useless. Gongjin yelled and rushed at Yoonjung, who stood there grasping his sword. His sword is swift and straight. A sword that can be seen clearly. A traditional sword that follows a predictable path. Yet, Yoonjung couldn't stop it. That was the difference between Yoonjung and Gongjin. A vast difference where clumsy tricks could not affect the technique's flow. But this time, Kang! Gongjin's outstretched sword was blocked by Yoonjung's blade. Huh? Quickly responding to the unexpected collision, Gongjin retrieved his sword and stabbed it again. It looks like you haven't just been playing around, but you still don't have a chance. Yoonjung continued to defend against Gongjin's consecutive assaults. It was fast and heavy. Gongjin's sword was faster and more intense than in the past. Yoonjung could fully realize just how much he had struggled to improve. It was at least twice as strong as the last time they fought. But why? Kang, kang, kang. Yunjong's sword moved concisely to block the opponent. 2 years ago, he couldn't even see this sword properly. That same frightening sword was even faster now. So why could he see it now? It was a complete mystery. Why can't I see it so clearly? It wasn't slow. The strikes were fast. Fast enough to loudly cry out as they sliced through the air. Yet Yunjong's eyes could perfectly discern the sword's path. It was nothing like the past where he couldn't react at all. Kang! Yunjong's sword traveled in a simple fashion to efficiently deflect Gongjin's strikes. Meanwhile, Gongjin was unable to overcome the recoil and struggled to correct his posture as he was pushed back. Yunjong looked at him with a puzzled face. Is this all you have? No, don't get angry. I'm not trying to provoke you or anything. I'm sincerely asking. You aren't trying to disgrace me by only using half your strength or anything, right? I need to be sure. You bastard! I'll kill you! Gongjin was boiling red with fury. Yunjong's innocent questions seemed like mockery to his ears. Seeing his reaction, Yunjong became more flustered at the situation rather than afraid. Chung Myung, what the hell did that bastard do to us? Every movement of his rushing opponent could be seen and felt. Yunjong could tell by the simple movements of Gongjin's shoulders which direction the strikes would come from. It was not predicting the sword's path. He could see it with his eyes and understand. Swish. Although the wooden sword was swung violently, Yunjong perfectly avoided it by taking a simple step back. The blade struck the empty air and fell in front of Yunjong. Gongjin's posture tilted as he put too much power into the sword. A small gap that the old Yunjong would have never been able to see had opened up in front of him, and he could see it as clear as day. Pwah! Yunjong's feet moved before his mind could fully process his own actions, kicking Gongjin in the side. When he saw that Gongjin had been thrown back by his kick, Yunjong unwittingly looked back. Chung Myung was looking at him with downcast eyes, as if he was bored and simply wanted this to end quickly. That crazy bastard! It was no wonder that Chung Myung was behaving strangely. It was as if he had already foreseen the results of this conference. Ah! Gongjin had lost all reason at that time as his mind drowned in anger. He ran towards Yunjong once again. Seeing his foe's charge, Yunjong spread his legs slightly and raised his sword. From the top, the basic posture of swordsmanship and the basic stance for the equilibrium of six sword. It was the same stance that Yunjong endlessly drilled into his body for 10 days straight. Gongjin's sword stretched out, and his movements began to change compared to the swordsmanship he displayed so far. If it was the old Yunjong, he would have felt flustered and been embarrassed by this sudden difference. But now, Yunjong's eyes could clearly see and understand everything. All the changes in swordsmanship eventually come through the fingertips. He fixed his lower body like a mountain and didn't miss a single movement. Swoosh! He saw it. The moment when the sword and body connected, Yunjong didn't miss that slight gap, and his body began to move automatically once he confirmed it. Whack! The sword cut through the air. A blade that slashed with no hesitation. An unshaken heart, a disciplined body, and a clear purpose. This sword connected these three cornerstones and pierced through Gongjin's sword path before striking him on the shoulder. Frightened, Gongjin suddenly turned his sword to block the attack. Kwang! And the sword soared into the sky. Gongjin's sword spun violently as it flew through the sky and landed in the distance. Thud. The subtle sound of the sword hitting the ground rang quietly through the training hall, which was stunned into silence. Everyone was quiet. Some jumped up and stared incredulously. Gongjin, the Jongnam sect's third-class disciple, had collapsed to the ground unconscious. In front of him, Yunjong firmly stood tall like a massive mountain. A perfect victory without any declaration needed. Yunjong, who looked at Gongjin, retrieved his sword and put it near his waist. I learned a lot, and turned around to return to his sect. Shortly after, a thunderous roar erupted. Whoa! We won! We won! Yunjong Sayang won! Insane! This makes no sense! Not just the children, even the elders and the undisciples were in an uproar. Yunjong! Yunjong! Act properly, Sayang! Hyunyoung deftly grabbed Hyunsang, who was about to rush over to Yunjong. Damn it! I'm going to lose it! We won! We won! Sayang, be dignified. Control yourself. Do I look like I can do that now? Even Hyunyoung couldn't hide his smile as he held on to Hyunsang. So good. Hyunsang was always harsh on himself. Just like how the finance division was stressed because of Mount Hua's condition, Hyunsang was troubled at the decline of their martial arts. As head of martial arts, he needed to lead the development of the sect's martial prowess. Yet, he was resentful because there was nothing he could do to raise the level the disciples were stuck at. He never showed it, but it was clear how frustrating it was. But the third-class disciples, who they expected nothing from, were trampling all over the Jongnam bastards. Sect leader. Hyunyoung looked at Hyunjong. He was smiling happily, kind and comfy. Just looking at him made one's heart warm. Ah, don't follow the light. Come back, sect leader. Hyunyoung threw away Hyunsang, ran to Hyunjong, and shook him by the shoulders. Get yourself together. Sect leader, not now. Don't let your soul escape. Everything has been accomplished. No, we still have a long way to go. Call the practitioner, medical practitioner. While that was happening, Yunjong returned to his group and shyly smiled at the Sahyungs. But he also felt like flying. But while everyone was dancing joyously, Jogul couldn't smile. It was his turn next. Sahyung, great Sahyung, how did you do that? What did you... Go. Yes, Sahyung. Just go. Huh? Yunjong smiled. Now he understood why Chung Myung didn't say anything and just told him to leave. You won't lose even if you want to. Just go. You will see soon enough. Jogul tilted his head, but Yunjong didn't speak anymore. With a stiff expression, Jogul headed to the center. Without even looking at Jogul, Yunjong went to Chung Myung and sat next to him, then firmly asked, What did you do to us? Chung Myung lightly smiled while looking at Yunjong. What? To us? Ah, that. Chung Myung smiled and spoke. Nothing much. I just made you win. That is what I'm asking. How did you do that? That goblin-like bastard. Chapter 102. Look there. Huh? Chung Myung pointed to the central area and spoke. While Jogul was taking his place, the disciples of the Jongnam sect came and retrieved the fallen Gongjin. What do you think of the Jongnam sect? What do you mean? Are they strong? Weak? Obviously they're strong. Chung Myung stared wide-eyed at Yunjong and asked, Then Sahyung defeated such a strong foe? Don't say that. It just happened. What do I know? Chung Myung shook his head and giggled. Strong. Right, strong. He's strong for his age, but he's weak too. What does that mean? It's because he learned so much more than what he should have been taught at that age. Isn't it good to learn a lot and get used to it? Sahyung. Chung Myung reached out and drew the shape of a tower. Martial arts are like a tower. How tall you build a tower depends on how strong the bottom floor and the foundation are. Right. But those people started building the second floor before the first was finished. Then, they added a third on top of the incomplete second as well. They're adding weight to the first floor and building taller without strengthening the foundation first. What do you think will happen if those kids collide with someone who perfectly developed their tower's ground floor? They'll collapse. That's right, Chung Myung said. All I did was clear away the wood on the first floor Sahyungs were building and reforge the foundation. It's difficult to build, but it won't crumble easily once built. I don't understand. Did that training have such meaning? What are the basics of martial arts? Huh? Chung Myung's face grew serious. There is one fundamental basic. To use the body to strike down the opponent perfectly. The stem forms from that one root and then the branches proliferate. I just had Sahyung focus on developing the roots. See? Chung Myung pointed to Jogul. Jogul was facing off against the Jongnam disciple that just came out. An unshakable lower body, clean swordsmanship, and the eyesight to carefully observe everything happening. And above all, Jogul's sword pushes the opponent's sword and delivers a blow. Concentration capable of bringing out all of the body's power at once. Chung Myung smiled. The disciple of the Jongnam sect collapsed, and Jogul looked at his opponent with a puzzled expression. He turned his head, unable to believe what he had done. For now, that is all you need. With that one alone, you can defeat all the kids your age. Of course, that isn't all. They also took the pill that Chung Myung gave them. By following through with Chung Myung's training regime, the disciples managed to create bodies that were second to none. If they didn't lag behind in physical strength and internal ki, their battles were bound to be decided by their swordsmanship, and anyone who faced them without a solid foundation was destined to fall before them. Jogul returned and looked at Chung Myung with blank eyes. Following his lead, another disciple from Mount Hua went forward, totally confident. He was full of desire to fight and bring honor to their sect. I still don't understand. If it's that easy, then why don't the other sects train like that? Easy? Chung Myung shook his head. Was the training until now easy? No, I didn't mean that. But conceptually. Sahyung. Yes? Sahyung must have studied, right? To be in good form, take rest, take care of one's parents sincerely, and not deceive the weak or be greedy for riches. Above all, be polite to others. Respect those below you, live life without losing yourself, keep your friends close, and be loyal to the nation. Can you do all of that? No. Why? Isn't that how you become a true man? Yunjong stayed silent. He knew what Chung Myung was talking about. Everyone knows what it means to be an exceptional man. However, only 2 or 3 people in the nation can follow every tenet throughout their entire lives. Such a small number within this vast nation. In other words, despite knowing what it takes, ordinary people cannot do it. Constant water dripping down can pierce a rock. Always devote yourself and work hard. Nothing is more important than effort. The ancestors endlessly emphasize hard work and dedication. Do you know the reason? Well, because people can't do that. Chung Myung had a bitter smile. In fact, Chung Myung was the same in the past. He always craved stronger swordsmanship and fame, even though his Sahyung constantly nagged him about concentrating on his basics. Even in Chung Myung's final moments, he sought higher ground and never looked down. It was only after death did he realize. Train to the point of death, push past your limits and devote yourself to it again and again. It might sound like nonsense. Chung Myung pointed to the central area. Gasp. Mount Hua's disciple was causing the Jongnam sect's disciple to falter and retreat. It was an impressive sight. Mount Hua's disciples wasn't giving his foe any chance to attack or recover. But that's what happens. Although we know what it takes, people can't push themselves that hard. Who would choose to do so? After 3 days, they'd lie down and say they can't do it, run away, or make some excuse. Yunjong nodded. Didn't they also try to escape? It was Chung Myung who grabbed them by the collar and forced them to continue. Sahyungs did it, Chung Myung said firmly. After you endured that, the match was already won. There is nothing more to see. Those who only look up without seeing what's beneath their feet will lose their footings and collapse. If a bird without wings believe it can fly, it'll only realize the truth after the jump. Chung Myung clicked his tongue when he saw the disciple of the Jongnam sect being carried away. Their feet betrayed them, and now they'll fall. Yunjong's eyes trembled. He thought that the training was being overdone. It wasn't just once or twice that he wanted to curse Chung Myung for his vicious methods. But he endured. He persevered until the end, hoping that he would grow stronger in some way. But all that training was done with a far-off future in mind. Where did this guy learn all this? Yunjong couldn't understand Chung Myung at all, but he was certain of one thing. Another Jongnam disciple fell to the ground. Yunjong knew. His sages weren't too different. At least, aside from Yunjong and Jogul, the 10 disciples representing Mount Hua were all roughly equal in their abilities. There was such a large difference between the previous disciples and his opponent, so the result of the next battle would be the same. That meant, we're going to win. Mount Hua's third-class disciples against the Jungnam sect. Yunjong could feel it. They were really winning against those bastards. We are winning. No one responded to Yunjong's words. They couldn't deny what was happening before them, but it wasn't easy to believe either. It was because they never thought this could happen, but there was no need for them to believe it. No matter what Yunjong or anyone else thought, the result of the conference was real. One person and another. Ah! A shrill scream signaled the end. In an instant, 10 disciples fell. Ah! We won! All 10! We won them all! Damn it! Chung Myung, we did it! We did it! The third-class disciples clenched their fists and cheered. Some even wept. Even the second-class disciples were running to embrace them. It was like a festival. 10 wins in a row. All of Mount Hua's third-class disciples were victorious. 10 consecutive victories followed after 10 straight losses. It was evident which side would have better momentum and which side had a greater sense of victory. The disciples from Mount Hua defeated the third-class disciples of the Jungnam sect. Chung Myung! Yunjong grabbed his hand with a thrilled expression. We won! We won! Thank you! Thanks to you! Right when Yunjong was about to speak words of admiration that he'd kept hidden in his heart, Chung Myung spoke. Win? An icy air instantly froze the heated atmosphere as Chung Myung's words escaped. Everyone's eyes focused on Chung Myung, who tilted his head to the side. What's wrong with him now? Here we go again. This time my heart will stop. Seeing their anxious gazes, he said, Like this? Again, what more now? We already lost 10 times. After winning 10 times, doesn't that make this a draw? Right. But that... Sahyong doesn't seem to know. Huh? There's nothing such as a draw in my vocabulary. Chung Myung's eyes shone again. Please. The atmosphere is so good, Chung Myung. Please. Draw? A draw with the Jungnam sect? I can't carry that embarrassment all my life. He would be cursed to death even after death. His Sahyong would softly smile down at him and stab away with sharp daggers like retorts and insults. And what about the other Sahyongs? They would drag him around everywhere and speak about how he came to a draw with the Jungnam sect. I'm not going to let that happen. Flames ignited in Chung Myung's eyes. If he was happy with the draw, he wouldn't have even bothered starting this battle. He still hadn't paid them back for snatching away the Plum Blossom Sword technique. Now, he was supposed to send them home with a draw after they insulted Mount Hua and the sect leader the entire time they were there? That isn't Chung Myung's style. Chung Myung began to laugh. This is the beginning. Just the beginning. Now, they won't even be able to walk themselves home. The third-class disciples slowly retreated, seeing Chung Myung's eyes gleaming in madness. He's completely lost it. Was he stabbed to death by the Jungnam sect in a previous life? Why does he always go insane when the Jungnam sect comes into the picture? Isn't this enough? What more are you going to do? It was then. Chung Myung got up from the seat and Yunjong jumped to his feet as well. Hey, stop him! Sahyong! When Yunjong tried to shout and stop his antics, Chung Myung spoke in a cold voice that was unlike his usual self. Huh? Pressured by force exuding from Chung Myung, Yunjong listened in bewilderment. From now on, don't miss a single move of what I do. This applies to everyone. Understood? Chung Myung headed off to the central area as the Sahyong simply nodded in response. Everyone merely stared at his back as if possessed. It was the back of the man that would lead Mount Hua, a sight they would see countless times from now on. Chapter 103. Sect leader, get yourself together. Where are the doctors? Are they still away? Doctor, get out of the way! Hyunsang pushed Hyunyoung aside, put his hand on Hyunjong's back, and quickly began to channel his ki into the man. No, his danjeon is shaking in happiness. Hyunsang was surprised. He had never heard of such an absurd thing. However, this bizarre event was happening right in front of him. Hyunjong took deep breaths as he received the elder's ki infusion. I've calmed down. Are you alright, sect leader? Am I fine? Hyunjong stared absent-mindedly at Hyunsang. The elder couldn't think of a time when he'd seen the sect leader look so dumbfounded before. You're asking me if I'm alright now. I made a mistake, Sahyung. What are... Oh my. Hyunjong took one deep breath after another. He wasn't able to calm down. Why? Hyunsang could understand. Even his hands were still trembling. How could the sect leader remain calm and not be thrilled right now? Yes, sect leader. Did you teach the children that? Smiled slightly. I wish I could answer yes. I would be able to stand tall with my shoulders straight, but unfortunately, I did not. The third-class disciples conducted this training by themselves. By themselves? Hyunjong looked back at incredulously, unable to understand. Saje, explain it to me. Eunam urged to be more detailed. Despite his usual calmness, he couldn't stifle his excitement at this moment. It was probably Chung Myung who... Chung Myung? Now, it wasn't so shocking. Whenever something happened, his name would come up. Even now, his heart somehow predicted this name would pop up. That child. What the hell has that child been doing? Wasn't the sect leader the one who gave him permission to enter the sect? You don't know anything about him. How could I know? He just showed up one day. I felt that it was meant to be, so I accepted him. That simple connection was creating unbelievable results. Ever since Mount Hua was destroyed by the demonic sect and the ancestors were annihilated, Mount Hua was unable to defeat the Jungnam sect. Actually, it wasn't correct to say that they had won. Objectively speaking, Mount Hua no longer had the strength to even compete with the Jungnam sect. That's why, despite all their previous provocations, Mount Hua was forced to remain silent and endure their lashings. However, the third-class disciples overcame this disparity in strength, and it wasn't just a victory, but a clean sweep. Oh, my ancestors. Hyunjong's eyes turned red. The day had finally arrived. Hyunjong firmly believed that this day would come, but he thought that it would be impossible to see it in his lifetime. He truly felt satisfied after witnessing this scene that he had always dreamt of. He couldn't bring himself to wish for anything more. Sect leader, we did it! The children did it! Yes, right. Quite terrific. Hyunjong wasn't even able to speak coherently. He just continued to agree over and over. Now that I've lived to see this, I can greet the ancestors with pride. What? Why is that child coming out again? Hyunjong blinked several times to double-check. However, the scene in front of him didn't change. With a wooden sword at his waist, Chung Myung walked toward the central area once more. He looked at Hyunjong. I think he's looking this way. What is he going to do now? Now, the expectations were greater than the concerns. Hyunjong clenched his fist and continued to observe. At that moment, Chung Myung smiled wickedly. Could a Taoist make such an expression? What the hell was he trying to do? At that moment, Hyunjong doubted whether this child had fallen from his path as a Taoist. You pathetic bastards! Sama Seung was about to lose himself to anger. He bit his lip so severely that it tore and blood flowed to the side. 10 consecutive losses. There was no defeat more disastrous. At first, they had secured 10 straight wins, but no one would remember that. Losing to Mount Hua, and in such an overwhelming fashion, had paralyzed the elder's mind. Even if Mount Hua was unable to stand against their sect, nobody could laugh off such a disgraceful event as losing 10 matches after dominating the previous 10. It wasn't technically a loss, but it almost felt worse. Didn't you all say You are going to victoriously return as proud disciples of the Jungnam sect. What the hell is this loss to Mount Hua? You pathetic bastards! As if spewing fire, he kept coughing out his anger. You idiots are destroying the honor of the sect. You lost to Mount Hua in front of so many people. To Mount Hua! Ugh, you assholes! The third-class disciples couldn't even look at Sama Seung or the second-class disciples who were glaring at them. While Sama Seung was overwrought with anger, Jin Gum-ryung glared at the young disciples as if he wanted to kill them. It was done. His hope for a clean victory had collapsed horribly. A draw with Mount Hua, something they never dreamed of. But wasn't that what happened? Damn it. Jin Gum-ryung couldn't hold back from cursing, despite his elder being there. As he turned his bloodshot gaze, filled with rage, towards Mount Hua's disciples, he was shocked at what he saw. That brat! Hearing his words, Sama Seung turned and watched as Chung Myung walked out. That bastard! Even if I tore him apart, it wouldn't be enough to calm down. As Sama Seung thought about it more deeply, wasn't that child the one who started everything? Why is he coming out again? Everyone present shifted their focus to Chung Myung. Oh my god, for such results. It seems like Mount Hua has sharpened their swords. Unimaginable. 10 wins. The third-class disciples from the Jungnam sect couldn't defeat even one of Mount Hua's disciples. And there was another thing no one spoke about. The third-class disciples from Mount Hua defeated their opponents even more overwhelmingly than how Jungnam's second-class disciples secured their victories. What's more, it was pitiful to reflect on how the Jungnam sect's disciples behaved while winning. At the time, it seemed natural for the strong to stand above their opponents. However, seeing Mount Hua's third-class disciples handle their victories with grace made the Jungnam's previous ridicule and provocation seem ugly and resentful. Aren't they superior in manners as well as their skill? Truly, Mount Hua is a sect that deserves to be called prestigious. I am shocked by their composure. It's going up, rising up and up. Mount Hua's name was rising up. At this moment, it had reached the sky. Meanwhile, Master Huang struggled to suppress a joyous scream from his heart. After this event, the audience would reassess their initial thoughts about Mount Hua. It was apparent that some were already calculating how much to invest, but the value will be difficult to determine. For them, these results were completely unexpected. The more Hwang Mun-yak thought about it, the more he realized just how wonderful it was for him to meet Chung Myung and invest in Mount Hua. Now then. It was then. Wait! Someone shouted while Master Huang was about to end the proceedings. Huh? Turning his head, he looked at the center and saw Chung Myung smiling. Isn't he that boy from earlier? He called himself Chung Myung. He spearheaded this victory. Hwang Mun-yak met Chung Myung's eyes while listening to the crowd gossip around him. What is it, young disciple? Chung Myung smiled and continued. I have a question I would like to ask. Since all of you saw everything that happened here, I think you can make an appropriate judgment. What was that? Who won? Huh? Who won? Well, Hwang Mun-yak's expression hardened. The young disciple doesn't want to end this with a draw. He didn't know what he planned, but he had to respond to it. Hwang Mun-yak slowly turned his head and looked at everyone as he asked, What do you think? Come to think of it, we have yet to decide the winner or loser. The people of Shaanxi who gathered there fell into thought and began to speak one after another. A draw seems appropriate, but if we had to determine a winner, wouldn't it be the Jungnam sect that won thanks to the older students? What nonsense! What's the purpose of this conference? Isn't it for the future of the sect? Then shouldn't we prioritize the third-class disciples? It's a victory for Mount Hua, where the younger generation prevailed. Huh? What are you saying? Potential is just potential. It's always possible that the third-class disciples will fail to surpass the Jungnam second-class disciples. Then, you have to look at the situation of the Jungnam sect's third-class disciples. They're all younger than the third-class disciples from Mount Hua. There's a big difference in their ages. The oldest of Mount Hua's second-class disciples are even younger than the youngest of the Jungnam Sect's disciples. No, you... There was no conclusion. Everyone had their own reasons, and they had their own preference for who won. Hwang Munyak, who listened from the side, then spoke. Young disciple, it is difficult to draw a conclusion. Right? Chung Myung snapped. But if this ends, it would be uncomfortable for the audience here. Besides that, I'm sure the Jungnam Sect would feel gloomy if we didn't settle this with certainty. What do you mean? Simple. Chung Myung pointed to the Jungnam Sect. The 10 people that won over there. The Jungnam Sect listened to Chung Myung. Against the only 10 that won from Mount Hua. Why us? Yunjong stuttered. Chung Myung looked at both sides and spoke. The only solution is to remove the losers and put the winners back into the match. Would that give a clear answer? Is he crazy? What's he planning? They're second-class disciples, and we are just third-class disciples. No, there's no way he would jump into a losing fight. He must be up to something. Without disappointing the expectations of his Sahyungs, Chung Myung put in a condition. Instead, yes. Just as the third-class disciples felt relieved, a sound, like thunder, fell. Let's set aside the boring one-on-one matches. One fighter will remain until the end. A fight where whoever wins continue battling until he loses. The winner will fight the next person in line. The last one standing wins. What do you think? Chung Myung looked at the Jungnam Sect with a unique smile. Of course, it's understandable if they're scared. It was an unavoidable attack. Chapter 104. Jin Gum-ryung was dumbfounded as he looked at Chung Myung. What the hell is he up to now? Another fight between the third and second class disciples, based on the winning streaks. Was that how he intended to win? Jin Gum-ryung sharpened his teeth. There is a limit to how much the Jungnam Sect can be ridiculed. As head of the second-class disciples, Jin Gum-ryung refused to let this transgression go. Even if Mount Hua's third-class disciples were able to dominate their opponents, wasn't that still just a battle between the same classes? This classing isn't something that can be overcome with talent and effort. If the difference between classes could be overcome so easily, the hierarchy of the sect's disciples would collapse. That's why many sects keep a large age gap between classes when accepting new disciples. No matter how strong the third-class disciples of Mount Hua were, there was a fundamental difference between that and challenging the second-class disciples. Jin Gum-ryung had never heard of a younger generation challenging the seniors of a sect before. Just being offered such a proposal was shameful. That bastard! As soon as Jin Gum-ryung called out, Sama-seung grabbed his shoulder. Elder, calm down. But Sama-seung's face distorted. Our name has already been dragged through the mud. If we reject this offer to save face, others will only say that we ran away in fear. Jin Gum-ryung bit his lip. He couldn't deny it. That damn bastard wouldn't think twice about spreading that rumor. If the battle had been proposed politely or gently, there would have been a justified way to reject it. However, there was no way out when the child so brazenly provoked their sect. It was a disgraceful proposal to accept, yet humiliating to reject. Sama-seung raised his head and looked at Chung Myung. Chung Myung, was it? Yes. You didn't seem to remember very well before, but now you seem to get it. I heard your suggestion, but I don't think you're in a position to make this offer on behalf of Mount Hua. Are you? Then ask the sect leader yourself. Well, it isn't that hard. You! That brat really could twist someone's stomach with words alone. I'm pointing out your attitude. There's an order to everything. Is this how they teach you in Mount Hua? It was a cheap but effective attack. Once in a bad mood, attack using age and manners. Hasn't this method been tried and true since the ancient past? I don't know how Mount Hua teaches because I only joined recently, so I haven't had the time to learn properly. Since I grew up as an orphan, I have my shortcomings, so I hope you understand. Suddenly mentioning his parents. Then what am I supposed to say? Chung Myung stared at Hwang Mun-yak while Sama Seung tried to find some other way to push him down. How about it? It seems fine. But there are only people from Mount Hua and the Jungnam sect here. We need an objective judgment. Someone to take our side. With the officials of Shaanxi present, Jungnam must strive for victory at all costs. They can't afford to step down, or else they'd be disgraced as cowards who are afraid of losing to their opponents. Hwang Mun-yak coughed and asked while looking at the crowd, "What do you think?" Regardless of what is fair or not, we would love to see more spars. Actually, I want to see how well the third-class disciples can hold their ground against the second-class disciples. It's very exciting. Hwang Mun-yak nodded his head. Of course the audience would agree. This would take the fighting to the next level. By asking a third-class disciple to face a second-class, one could see how strong the disciples really are. I'm looking forward to it, young disciple. Chung Myung nodded his head. So the audience has given permission. Sect leader, how about you? Hyunjong looked at Chung Myung with a puzzled expression. What is he doing? Hyunjong asked Eungum for help. Allow him, sect leader. Allow? You think I should allow this nonsense? He's a smart child. Eungum spoke firmly. Maybe this sounds exaggerated, but I've never felt that child to be foolish or immature. In fact, there are times when it seemed like he was teasing me or trying to pull one over my head. Didn't sect leader also admit that this boy has a certain depth to him? Sure, but... Clearly, that was the case with Chung Myung. He was like an old man wearing the mask of a child. There is no way such a child could act ignorant suddenly. I'm sure that he has an answer ready, so please allow it. Above all else, Eungum smiled and spoke. What's wrong with losing now? We have nothing to lose anyway. Hyunjong looked at Eungum, confidence gleaming within his eyes. Hyunjong looked at the remaining elders and confirmed their thoughts through their eyes before nodding in consent. If it's as Eungum said, then everything that's happened was due to that child's plan. There was nothing left to do but to trust that everything would work out. Hyunjong wondered if he was expecting too much from a child, but Mount Hua truly had nothing to lose. Even if they lost horribly, they wouldn't forget the victories they had already earned. Hyunjong, who made up his mind, spoke in a loud voice. Mount Hua agrees. Immediately, cheers erupted from the onlookers. Oh, then the Jungnam can't back down. Such spectacular events today. I need to talk about what I saw. I didn't expect such a lively show. Mount Hua is Mount Hua after all. No wonder it's said to be the most prestigious sect. There may be ups and downs, but there's no downfall. Hwang Mun-yak smiled bitterly as he heard the change in the crowd's attitude. Bat-like bastards. But this was the nature of a merchant and the general reaction of most people. Isn't it human nature to want to befriend powerful and promising figures? In other words, Mount Hua was starting to look like a place worthy of risk and trade. Then, how will the Jungnam sect react? Personally, Hwang Mun-yak would never accept this offer because there were no benefits to be won, but much to lose. But what if he was in Sama Seung's position? I would accept. Unlike merchants, a martial arts sect cannot simply withdraw. This was because of their self-esteem and pride. It was impossible to retract their tail and cower away after receiving such an advantageous offer from a sect that's weaker than themselves. So naturally, we agree as well. That's right, they would obviously come out. Hwang Mun-yak looked at them with excitement. Yoonjung sprinted up with a terrified face and grabbed Chung Myung before dragging him along. What's wrong with you? When Chung Myung protested, Yoonjung pulled him to the corner and softly asked, Brat, what are you up to? What? How can we defeat the second-class disciples? They're the second-class disciples of the Jungnam sect. Chung Myung, the best in Shaanxi. Oh, really? No way. Do you really think we can beat them? Are you saying we got that much stronger? Sahyung, huh? Do you think people should have a conscience? I rescued a drowning man, and now he wants to fight someone that's armed with a club in hand. What? You think you could win? No. I was just asking. Yoonjung was excited and hopeful, just a little bit. Don't even dream about it. You won't win. especially over Jingomryung. If it was any other disciples, maybe it was worth a try. Well, that wouldn't be easy either, but if Jingomryung steps forward, none of the third-class disciples would be able to do anything. What Chung Myung taught would work on those of the same age, but the difference was too great when fighting someone older and more experienced. Then what are you going to do? Chung Myung chuckled. The plan is simple. Elimination match, Sama Seung said firmly. It's obvious what they're planning. They want to whittle down our strength by cycling through the disciples in order to score at least one victory against us. After battling 9 times in a row, their last competitor will be able to secure an easy victory over an exhausted disciple. Sama Seung immediately recognized what was happening. The victor continues to fight. In other words, those who don't lose can't step down. If they continue to win consecutively, they will drain all of their stamina. Maybe he assumed that Jingomryung would lead the charge. Jingomryung takes the lead. After 9 of the third-class disciples came out, he would be exhausted and out of stamina. Finally, Chung Myung would come and defeat the tired Jingomryung. 9 defeats and only 1 victory. But this one win would be worth more than all 9 defeats. The fact that Jingomryung of the Jungnam sect was defeated by Mount Hua's third-class disciples would spread. Sama Seung ground his teeth. Such a sneaky bastard. Shaking his head, he looked at Jingomryung. You know what you have to do. Jingomryung. Without losing, over 10, over 20, I will deal with as many as you like. No. Huh? Sama Seung shook his head. There's no need for you to jump into their trap. Jingomryung showed a look of disgust. But what pride is there in willingly jumping into your enemy's trap? People will only discuss how those third-class disciples toyed around with you. Jingomryung bit his lip. That made sense. This match was strange from the start and could be interpreted that way. You will go last. Yes, I understand. The first. Sama Seung turned his head. You beg. You go. Yes, Elder, I will not disappoint you. It's alright even if we don't win every match. Defeat as many as you can until you run out of stamina. Once you feel exhausted, simply surrender and return. Never fall under their swords. Do you understand? Yes. Sama Seung gnashed his teeth. It was best if Yubek defeated everyone. If he's unable to, at the very least, they should finish by only sending out 2 people. Then, Jong So-han. Since Gomryung can't go out, he's the next best. Lee Song-baek has been strong lately as well. At that moment, he heard a bizarre whistling sound and looked at the stage. What? And Sama Seung saw it. Chung Myung, who had been dragged away by someone to talk to, walked out on stage with a wooden sword draped over his shoulder. Plan? What plan? Hurry and come get beaten. I'm the plan. Chung Myung smiled as he lowered his head. I'll make this day you can never forget, Jungnam sect. It was a calm but bold declaration. Chapter 105. Everyone's eyes were focused on Chung Myung. The fact that Chung Myung took the lead was something no one predicted. Anybody with some knowledge of martial arts? No, even a person with no understanding of martial arts could tell that Chung Myung was the most exceptional among Mount Hua's third-class disciples. Usually, the strongest fighter would wait until the final moment to have a favorable chance at victory, especially in events like this where the winner continues until they lose. What the hell is he thinking? Does he want to fight against the Jungnam sect's disciples head-on? Those who predicted some kind of trick out of Chung Myung were confused and struggled to comprehend his actions. Hyunjong and Eungom were the same, as were Hwang Moon-yak and Yoonjong. Sa-young, shouldn't we stop him now? I will take the lead, then... You know there's nothing we can do, right? When the third-class disciples approached him and asked, Yoonjong frowned. How can we stop him when he's the one throwing himself out there? Everyone's concerned gazes focused on Chung Myung's back, but Chung Myung simply kept his sights on the Jungnam sect. Do kids today know the legend of the strongest swordsman that single-handedly defeated a gang of people when he was just 15? Maybe the story was still told. Well, This person was from an era even before Chung Myung, but he had heard this story over and over again. It's said that Buddha was just 18 when he gained insight. That was also a story that resonated throughout the world. Other than that, there were no other examples. The masters of those generations who made names for themselves since childhood must have also been told similar legends. Why? Because without such stories, there would be no conversation. The world they lived in praised the strong. In order to prove one's strength and display their skills, a worthy opponent must be overcome. No matter how strong Mount Hua becomes, no one would appreciate the change if they could not prove it. Whether they grew twice as strong or 10 times, no one would ever know that change came to Mount Hua. Change must be seen with the eyes and experienced with the body. Every powerful person needed to recognize the change Mount Hua was undergoing. That was the quickest way to rebuild Mount Hua's reputation. And today, Chung Myung intended to create a legend that would spread the name of Mount Hua. There are 2 ways to make a name for a sect. One is to build achievements that no one can ignore, and the other is to prove the sect's strength. The strongest sect, that's good. The best swordsman in the world, that's good too. However, the best way is to have rising stars among the disciples. People treat others the most favorably when they have higher expectations of them. The strongest sect may be seen as an enemy, while the strongest swordsman would be seen as competition. Rather than those options, having powerful disciples with potential that live up to the expectations of others is the most comfortable way. There is a reason that young geniuses are evaluated as rising dragons and tigers. This was an eternal law of sects that had been passed down from generation to generation. Mount Hua's third-class disciples defeated the Jungnam sect's third-class disciples. That would be a fun story. The third-class disciples defeated Jungnam sect's second-class disciples. That's a remarkable event. But a single third-class disciple from Mount Hua swept through Jungnam sect's second-class disciples one after another. This news would turn the world upside down, and it would be a shame that the Jungnam sect would be unable to wash away for generations. Chung Myung smiled. Why did you have to touch Mount Hua? If you wanted to touch it, you should have done it when I wasn't alive. Well, shouldn't I collect some interest while I'm at it? As Chung Myung raised his sword, Yubek approached and stood across from him as he spoke. Your confidence is clearly second to none in this world, but I'll let you know that self-confidence without skill is a shortcut to a disgraceful defeat. Phew. Chung Myung just lifted his sword without answering. Normally, he would have said something back, but now he wasn't in the mood. Instead, he looked back at the third-class disciples of Mount Hua. Sa-hyung, concentrate on the match. Remember my words. Do not miss a thing. Huh? Perhaps this was a rare chance to see an interesting performance from a real match. Chung Myung looked at Yubek and said, Mount Hua's third-class disciple, Chung Myung, asks for a match. Yubek, who was about to say something, flinched and then accepted. The Jungnam sect's second-class disciple, Yubek, accepts Mount Hua's offer. The third-class disciples who were watching felt their bodies tense up. There's something different about him right now. This wasn't the usual Chung Myung that they knew. The usual Chung Myung would have provoked the enemy in front of him the moment he stood against him. However, his iconic playfulness was nowhere to be found. A frigid feeling came from his back that left them feeling cold. Like a swordsman heading into the battlefield. Yoonjung couldn't take his eyes off Chung Myung as if he was possessed. He felt that something extraordinary was about to happen. And at that moment, Chung Myung's sword moved slowly. The sword that began moving from above slowly descended until it was brought back to its original form. Yoonjung couldn't breathe as he saw this scene. The initial form. Chung Myung was now displaying the initial form of the equilibrium of six sword. The initial form was a greeting and courtesy to inform the opponent that he was ready to begin. But now, Yoonjung felt as if he was being sucked into that otherwise simple movement. It was an absolutely perfect sword, with perfect speed and perfect form. How could so much be shown with just that one movement? Yoonjung realized that this wasn't something that was being shown to the opponent. It was meant for Mount Hua's disciples. From now on, he would be using the equilibrium of 6 sword, so he was asking them to pay attention. "Don't miss it," Yunjong shouted unconsciously. "Don't miss a single one of Chung Myung's moves. Never! Don't even blink! Just watch him!" No one replied. They all just nodded. They were all trying their best to capture Chung Myung's movements. "I'll fix that troublemaking head of yours." Perhaps Yubek couldn't understand how fearsome Chung Myung was. Or maybe it was because of his opponent's pressure. But Yubek burst into a scream as he rushed at Chung Myung. Chung Myung's eyes just looked at him coldly. Equilibrium of 6. This sword technique was the basis of all Mount Hua swordsmanship. 4 cardinal directions brought together on earth and beneath heaven combines into 6. It represents everything within the world as well as unity. That was the essence of the simple and basic swordsmanship. Stab, cut, slash, block. Nothing more than basic swordsmanship. But in the end, every sword technique in the world begins with these movements. No sword can escape this rule. The opponent's sword danced gracefully in the sky. That! Hyunjong's eyes went wide as he noticed something strange. That swordsmanship was reminiscent of a flower in full bloom. Doesn't it seem familiar to something he had heard about? Did the Jungnam sect have such sword arts? Aside from the beautiful appearance, the sharpness of the swordsmanship was apparent. Dozens of sword-like forms swept in for Chung Myung with bizarre petal-like movements. However, Chung Myung's eyes began to ice over and emit a deathly chill as he saw this technique. Chung Myung merely took a single step forward, aiming for the top. At the same time, he thrust his sword ahead. The change that was forming in the air disappeared like a ghost. How? Chung Myung's sword, which precisely struck and interrupted the flowing swordplay, hit Yubek's wrist. Yubek retreated as he felt the heavy pain assail his senses. But it was an obvious mistake. Chung Myung took another step and swung his sword down. Chung Myung's wooden sword, loaded with ki, collided with Yubek's simple sword and echoed loudly with a dull sound. Somehow, he had managed to raise his sword in time to block. However, the weight of Chung Myung's blow came crashing down upon his body. Yubek eventually pushed the sword of Chung Myung away and stepped back. However, with a cold and expressionless face, Chung Myung stepped closer and swung his sword. There was no flashy movement. It wasn't some sharp sword or weighted move. It was a simple sword movement. Stab, cut, slash, block. Yet, the child's sword couldn't be blocked. If it was blocked, the blade would fly again. And if it was pushed away, it would strike the chin. What is this? Yubek blocked and blocked again. But each time Chung Myung's sword was blocked, he would be pushed back several steps. Just once! He only needed one opportunity. Then, by inserting his sword into that gap, he could display his sect's swordsmanship. If he could unfold the Jungnam sect's newest sword art, then this cheeky bastard could be defeated. But... Unfortunately for him, Chung Myung's sword struck before he could fully display the technique earlier. His wrist seemed to have been broken as he screamed in agony. But with his pride on the line, he didn't withdraw. Once! Just break through the child's sword once. But the sword of Chung Myung kept coming. And the cost of not receiving Chung Myung's sword properly was great. Chung Myung's sword fell at a slow pace. It wasn't quick, yet it destroyed Yubek's flow. What the hell is this? Realizing that he was being driven into a corner, Yubek looked at Chung Myung's sword as if his soul had been drained from his body. Stab. Swing. Yet, he couldn't find a single gap between those movements. Perfect. It was absolutely perfect. Kang. In the end, Yubek was unable to keep up with the change in movement, and his sword was deflected away. As his sword rose into the sky, Yubek stared at Chung Myung's sword as it cleanly slashed from his head. This must be a dream! Pang! Chung Myung's sword stopped right in front of his head. He didn't hit, but that was enough. Unable to handle the strike, Yubek stumbled back. Saje! Sayoung! That was the end. Staring at the Jungnam disciples that gathered, Chung Myung simply continued to gaze at them from afar. Those who received that look felt a chill run down their spine and took a step back. Chung Myung spoke with the softest voice. Next, that was the moment when the Jungnam Sect disciples desperately realized that something was wrong. Chapter 106. The world seemed to freeze as a chilling silence descended on Mount Hua. No one could open their mouths and no one thought to move. Those who knew martial arts couldn't speak because they understood just how incredible the spectacle before their eyes was. Even those who didn't know martial arts recognized that something extraordinary had happened just now. Sama Seung looked at Chung Myung with trembling eyes. With just basic swordsmanship, he overpowered Yubek without being hit a single time. Those consecutive movements smoothly flowed together like water. Yubek, who was caught within, couldn't counter. Would it have been possible for me to do the same? Sama Seung couldn't immediately answer the question that popped into his head. Subduing Yubek in an instant was something Sama Seung could do. However, only using a basic sword technique to subdue an opponent without giving them a chance to counterattack was different. Even if someone twice as strong as Sama Seung came, it couldn't be guaranteed that he would perform at the level of Chung Myung. It was a matter of how perfectly the basics were mastered and performed. To put it crudely, a vast and robust root. Not some colorful branches and stems. A firm root that supported everything but stayed invisible. What the hell did he do? There was a deeper meaning to the fact that the roots were so massive. And this was that the child will grow into a giant tree. He will become a great tree that can cover all of Mount Hua. At that moment, a cold voice penetrated Sama Seung's mind. Next, Sama Seung's eyes trembled as he looked at Chung Myung. The cold eyes made one sink into the abyss, with his sword pointed to the Jungnam Sect. He must be stopped. This fight was fine, but if Chung Myung grows in the future, everyone will be covered under this child's shadow one day. Right. It would be just like when the Plum Blossom Sword Saint roamed about in the past. Elder! Only then did Sama Seung come to his senses, and after looking at his disciples, he clenched his teeth and thought, who should I send? It was then Jung So-han growled and glared at Chung Myung. Elder, I will go. I will take him down and teach Mount Hua a lesson. One could only see as much as they knew. Chung Myung's strength was unknown to the Jungnam Sect's disciple. Jung So-han didn't understand what he was facing. What should I do? Sama Seung was a bit worried. So-han. Yes, Elder. Don't lose easily. Tire him out. What? Do what you are told. Jung So-han looked at the Elder with a puzzled expression and nodded. I will do as the Elder commands. Go. Yes! Jung So-han grabbed his wooden sword and moved. Jin Gum-ryung, who was silent till then, spoke. Elder, it might be difficult to say, but... Sama Seung turned his gaze to Jin Gum-ryung. Seeing his face, Jin Gum-ryung flinched and stepped away without realizing it. It was cold. A face that was so cold he could feel his bones chilling. Sama Seung turned away his glare. Jung So-han took a deep breath. I'm not being careless. I don't understand my opponent, and I'm not overconfident. If he could do his best, the child would lose. If he was careless like Yubek, then horrible things could happen. I commend you for defeating Yubek, but I am... The words found themselves trapped within his throat, his mouth, which unable to speak and couldn't move. Silence. Chung Myung, who was standing in front of him, seemed to slowly be melding into his surroundings. Jung So-han began to feel an oppressive sinking feeling. This? He didn't realize it while standing in the crowd. However, Chung Myung's aura was something he never faced before. Not even Jin Gum-ryung or their teacher could give him this feeling. He gulped at the thought as his muscles tensed. His instincts were screaming that it was dangerous just by looking at Chung Myung in front of him. Chung Myung's half-hearted eyes calmly observed him. At that moment, without realizing it, Jung So-han took his stance. All the thoughts inside his head disappeared. It felt like only he and Chung Myung existed in this world. At that moment, Chung Myung took a slow step. Although everyone could see that it was a slow step, Chung Myung's body reached Jung So-han instantly. He firmly exerted force on the ground through his legs. The force of the recoil traveled through the waist, and the waist moved to give power to the upper body. As if absorbing that force, the sword swung ferociously. Bang! Nothing fancy. Power, speed, accuracy, just the basics. The sword's power that faithfully adhered to the basics ascended beyond the basics. Jung So-han's legs trembled. As Chung Myung advanced one step ahead, Jung So-han's posture crumbled, and he lost balance as his body twisted with a muffled sound. No! And that was it. Jung So-han's eyes saw the wooden sword falling toward his head. There was fear and shock in his eyes. Unbelievable! Kwang! Jung So-han fell to the floor, blood dripping. This sword. Just this sword. The second greatest of Jongnam's second-class disciples, Jung So-han, was defeated with a single strike to the head. Everyone witnessing this stood aghast in shock. Receiving these shocked gazes, Chung Myung softly spoke. Next, he just silently looked at the Jongnam sect. Now, the Jongnam sect seemed to finally understand. Their faces went stiff as if they had seen a ghost. Not yet. It was too early to be surprised, because Chung Myung still had more to show. He had no intention of being content with just this. Considering what the Jongnam sect did to Mount Hua, such a defeat was nothing but a light punishment. Today, here, Chung Myung would leave an indelible mark on the Jongnam sect. As long as Mount Hua survives in this world, and as long as the Jongnam sect exists, this day will remain a stigma in their sect's history. You did something you shouldn't have done. Mount Hua gave everything to save the world. Despite Chung Myung's dissuasion, his Sahyungs all gave up their lives for the sake of the world. And what was the cost? Shit! The anger that had been suppressed turned into a cold flame that burned in Chung Myung's chest. In the world we protected, the Jongnam sect was there. Instead of repaying the favor, the Jongnam sect stole the Plum Blossom Sword technique and despised Mount Hua. Now, they were even trying to destroy it. Well, everyone endured it till now. Chung Myung kept control of himself. Several times a day, he felt his broken heart ache. Finally, he didn't need to hold back the anger he'd been suppressing anymore. Next, when Chung Myung sharply shouted, the disciple of the Jongnam sect shuddered. A few came forward and carried Jung So-han away. One of them remained with a stiff face and stood facing Chung Myung with the sword. I've already shown off the equilibrium of 6. Then let's move on to the next technique. Chung Myung retook his stance. A groan that seemed to breathe in sounded from behind him. Falling flower sword! After taking the basic form, Chung Myung raised his sword and aimed it at the foe in front of him, and sprinted ahead. It's different. Jogul clenched his fist. Chung Myung's movements changed completely. They weren't serious and concise like what had been previously shown. These were sharp movements like wind blowing through a canyon. Just by changing the sword technique, his entire bearing changed. How could one man have such perfect execution? Flowers blooming on an old tree along the cliff seemed to be swept away by this violent wind. Swish! A completely incomparable speed to Chung Myung's previous technique was displayed. Such a formidable attack went flying towards the disciple from the Jongnam sect. Kang! The moment it seemed to be blocked, the sword was recovered faster than it stabbed, and then continued the assault again and again. What? Kwang! The sword that was blocked quickly retreated back. Usually, when dealing with a swift sword, a martial artist would strike after defending before their opponent has time to recover their stance and withdraw their sword. That was the trick. However, the Jongnam sect's disciple had no way to counterattack despite knowing that. The moment he tried to attack, Chung Myung's retrieved sword would stab again. Faster. Even faster. Sometimes the sword would just brush past the shoulder, but even so, that light contact felt like it had enough destructive force to crush the bones. The Jungnam Sect's disciple couldn't find a proper way to deal with the attack and recklessly decided to swing his sword. No, he tried to. Chung Myung's sword struck his throat before he could even place strength in his hand. The disciple collapsed on the spot. Thud. Chung Myung looked at the fallen disciple and said, "Next." Yunjung seemed deflated as he gasped. That is the falling flower sword? Different. It was different from what he or Jogul did. If the equilibrium of 6 was loyal to the basics, then this sword technique centered on pleasure and was the core of Mount Hua's swordsmanship. Chung Myung was now showing them. This is the true falling flower sword. This is Mount Hua's sword. Falling flower sword. The sword they learned. To be honest, Yunjung never thought that Mount Hua's sword technique could be as good as the Jungnam Sect's. Even though swordsmanship wasn't everything, Mount Hua's martial arts tended to fall a bit short if it was evaluated calmly. So far, Yunjung, no. That was what all the third-class disciples thought. But instead of using 100 words, Chung Myung showed them through a single battle. It's been said that Mount Hua's martial arts used to be superior to the Jungnam Sect. That may be the reason why Chung Myung was fighting them with those techniques. What have I even been looking at till now? The children that had envied the abilities of others without properly understanding their own techniques felt ashamed of themselves. "Sayoung, the falling flower sword." Right. Yunjung knew what Jogul was trying to say. Yunjung nodded his head and spoke. "Don't take your eyes off him. That is Mount Hua's sword. The sword of Mount Hua that we need to learn and pass on." Yunjung realized one thing. Perhaps after today, the disciples of Mount Hua will no longer be the same. Once they have witnessed this absurd sight, they can never turn back. The image of Chung Myung's back, wielding his sword, was burned into their eyes. That bastard, who always ran his arrogant mouth, at this moment was silently leading them with his back. Show us more. What Mount Hua's sword meant. How strong Mount Hua's sword can be. The world was getting quieter and quieter. In the eyes of Yunjung, the figure of Chung Myung grew larger. It appeared as if Chung Myung was the only one standing in the whole world. Chapter 107. Thud. Another one fell. The blood drained from the faces of the Jungnam Sect's disciples as they stood in shock. 6. 6 had fallen. A total of 6. 6 second-class disciples from the Jungnam Sect had been defeated by a single third-class disciple. It was an utterly one-sided defeat as well. But it wasn't the current losses that left them terrified. What truly scared them was the creeping realization that they may not be able to secure even a single victory in this match. Will we be completely annihilated by just one third-class disciple? Their fingers turned numb, and a cold sweat ran down their spine. Their eyes clouded over in despair, and their legs lost strength. Was there anyone here that didn't understand how disgraceful this was? This event was 1 in 1,000. If such news leaked, it would travel the world before the disciples could even return home. For Mount Hua, this would be a glorious achievement, and for the Jungnam Sect, this would be a humiliation that would last for generations. That historically absurd disgrace was occurring right here and now on Mount Hua. Realizing that, the Jungnam Sect disciples felt a sense of fear that went beyond this moment's pressure. Next! In their ears echoed the most terrifyingly heartless voice. No one stepped forward. They weren't stupid. If it happened once or twice, it would be considered luck. But winning 6 times in a row was no coincidence. It was unbelievable, but Mount Hua's third-class disciple, Chung Myung, was stronger than them. Overwhelmingly. They were no longer afraid of stepping forward and losing. However, the burden of being one of the disciples that contributed to this catastrophic defeat was terrifying beyond measures. Someone go. I can't. Sayoung, shouldn't Sayoung go? What am I supposed to do? It was at that moment. Pathetic. Chung Myung spoke in a cold voice. The disciples of the great Jungnam sect are afraid of a child that's 10 years younger than them. You all seem to have forgotten about shame. Everyone was unable to respond and merely bowed their heads. Chung Myung took a step forward. I will go. Sayoung! I cannot watch that arrogant bastard any longer, so watch me as I regain the sect's honor, although I don't know if there is any honor left to reclaim. Chung Myung's face twisted like a ravenous demon, but someone spoke just as he was about to walk out. Stop! Chung Myung turned to see that Sama Seung was looking at him with a stiff face as he called on someone else. Manjok! Yes, elder. You go. Sama Seung cut the disciples' words off as if to preempt and nip any excuses in the bud. Go out there and drag him down by the ankles. Do you understand what I mean? Yes. Chung Myung tried to disagree, but Sama Seung stopped him. Come here. But the fight is... That's enough. Come here. Sama Seung led Chung Myung to the back. After reaching an isolated place where no one could hear them, Sama Seung spoke in a low voice. Do you think the other kids can win? Chung Myung couldn't answer. It was a question with an obvious answer. However, the reason he couldn't respond wasn't that he felt sorry for his juniors. It was because he couldn't understand the reality of what was happening. Nothing was lacking about the second-class disciples' skills, yet they lacked confidence despite their efforts. They no longer had any chance against Chung Myung with such a mindset. Sama Seung spoke bluntly to the confused Chung Myung. Your thoughts aren't wrong. Yes? That's a monster. No, I would call him a monster cub, but if you leave him alone, he will become a real monster one day. Elder, and that monster will block the Jungnam sect's path again. Do you understand what I mean? Chung Myung's eyes went wide. Is that possible? Chung Myung had to admit that Chung Myung is incredibly strong for his age, but could he really become a hindrance to their sect? Saying that Chung Myung would block the sect's path was the same as saying that Chung Myung would be unable to handle him. Whether it's true or not, at least Sama Seung thought so. His blood boiled inside. Does that mean I can barely handle that child? This was an insult he'd never heard before. Chung Myung's expression revealed the anger that he couldn't hide. Sama Seung looked deeply into his eyes and spoke. Myung, you are a genius. But how many people do you think get called geniuses? It's not something I want to say, but there are at least 10 men of your caliber in your generation alone. Maybe it's even more than that. Chung Myung tightly clenched his teeth. Sama Seung coldly asked, do you believe that you can be the strongest in the world in the future? Chung Myung may be the most confident person in the world, but even he didn't dare to lightly answer that question. The title of strongest in the world held too much weight. When Chung Myung hesitated to answer, Sama Seung narrowed his eyes. Master, geniuses, this title may be enough to carry on the spirit of the Jungnam sect and lead our sect into a golden era. However, Sama Seung finally arrived at the main point he really wanted to say. Being the best in the world is impossible. Those who compete for the position of the strongest in the world are monsters, not geniuses. Only those who casually ignore common sense, crush down the laws with their power, and defy all reason with their talents can stand on that stage. Right? Sama Seung's head slowly turned towards the center. Monsters like him. Chung Myung's shoulder trembled. Elder, Chung Myung was about to cry out in protest when he was suppressed by the elder's cold voice. But it became difficult to breathe. He may be a monster, but he's still just a cub. Even a dog can bite a tiger to death if it's just a baby. Chung Myung understood the meaning behind Sama Seung's words and stared at him in shock. As if to affirm Chung Myung's startling thoughts, a quiet and eerie voice penetrated his ears. "Kill him." Elder," Sama Seung whispered with a ghastly visage. "It's still possible. He is a monster, but he can be dealt with now. You must kill him. If you don't kill him now, we will never get another chance in this lifetime. Don't forget, people with talent don't become the best. Among those called geniuses and prodigies, only one person can truly stand at the peak. Do it now. If you can't kill him, at least cut off his arm." Chung Myung unknowingly stepped back. He's lost his mind. It wasn't because of what was said, but a certain sense of madness was glowing in his eyes. Whatever it was, it didn't seem normal. "Elder, think rationally." "Rational?" Sama Seung burst into laughter before grinding his teeth. "Are you going to live in his shadow for the rest of your life?" Chung Myung shut his mouth. Under the shadow of that child. Chung Myung clenched his fist. His nails digging into the palm of his hand nearly punctured the flesh. It was such a humiliating thought that he couldn't bear it. "The choice is yours," Sama Seung said while growling. "You don't need to take all the responsibility for this. You just made a mistake. Mistakes are common in spars like this, don't you think so?" Chung Myung looked at Sama Seung with fire raging within his eyes and spoke. "First of all, let me be clear. I am not someone who can be overshadowed by a child like him." Despite those bold words, Sama Seung waited for Chung Myung to continue. "But," he continued with a cold face, "if that child's existence will become an obstacle for the Jongnam sect, then there's no reason to follow the rules." A sinister smile blossomed on Sama Seung's lips. "That's right." Thud. Another disciple fell. With this, 8 have fallen to Chung Myung. Chung Myung lowered his sword and looked at the Jongnam sect. There were only 2 left, and he arrogantly stared at his remaining foes. Not yet. It is too early for despair. There was something else Chung Myung had prepared. "It doesn't look like I'm getting to 10 wins so easily." Of course, Chung Myung would appear in the end, but it's difficult for them to find someone to fill the final role. Who was going to come forward when they were all terrified? It's unfortunate. Do I need to be content with my current win record? It was then. Step. A man steadily walked out without saying a word. Chung Myung seemed shocked upon seeing who it was that approached the stage. "Why?" The person approaching smiled modestly. "I know it's too early for me to compete with you, but our sect is suffering a great humiliation, so I can't just sit on the sidelines and watch from behind." Chung Myung nodded his head. This guy was surely worth it. Lee Song-baek, who he had already met at the Eunha Guild, came to face Chung Myung. The Jongnam Sect's Lee Song-baek, a second-class disciple, asks disciple Chung Myung for a match. Mount Hua's third-class disciple, Chung Myung, accepts. The two stood facing one another with swords drawn. What do I do? Chung Myung looked at Lee Song-baek. Even though he was from the Jongnam Sect, Chung Myung didn't hate him. But Chung Myung lowered his sword after much consideration and gently closed his eyes. It wouldn't hurt to show him. If he could accept and overcome it, then it would be medicinal. If he could not overcome this, it would be poison. It would all depend on Lee Song-baek. Ta! Lee Song-baek screamed as he charged. Chung Myung's sword also began to move slowly. Lee Song-baek was someone that would grow by using the old methods of the Jongnam Sect. The current Chung Myung could show him where to begin. But a little should be enough for Lee Song-baek. The tip of Chung Myung's sword was aimed precisely at Lee Song-baek. And at that moment, Lee Song-baek, who was running towards Chung Myung, opened his eyes wide. The sword! Chung Myung's entire body was covered by the sword. No, the sword that stabbed towards Lee Song-baek grew so large that it obscured his view of Chung Myung. No, that's not it either. Not visible. Not being able to feel it. The only thing he could see and feel was the sword aimed at him. Is that true unity with the sword? A huge shock swept through Lee Song-baek's body before he could fully comprehend what was happening. Thud. As blood dripped down, Lee Song-baek stepped back and subtly smiled. I saw it. Thud. Lee Song-baek fell to the floor. 9 consecutive losses. Now there was only one left. Chung Myung turned to look at the Jongnam Sect's disciples. No, his gaze was aimed at just one person. Come out! Jin-gum-ryung. It's finally time to pay for your sins, Jongnam Sect. Chapter 108. The sound of wind escaped from Hyunjong's mouth. Still, he didn't risk turning his eyes away from the center for even a moment. Hyunjong's gaze moved from Lee Song-baek to Chung Myung. Another win. After winning 9 times, Chung Myung was waiting for his final opponent. The elders and disciples that gathered together were watching in suffocating silence. No one wanted to disturb this atmosphere by speaking first. Doubts about Chung Myung. Doubts about the situation. Those were probably valid concerns to consider, but they could find out later. What was important now was that Chung Myung was on the verge of achieving a full victory over the Jongnam Sect. Has this ever happened in the history of Mount Hua? Mount Hua and the Jongnam Sect have always been wary of each other. Looking at it objectively, Mount Hua often stood ahead of the Jongnam Sect throughout history. Of course, the tide had turned in recent generations, but looking at both sects' histories, it was undeniable. Yet, as far as Hyunjong knew, there was never a situation in Mount Hua's history where they crushed the Jongnam Sect so one-sidedly. Of course, there were legends that the Jongnam Sect couldn't even step outside during the Plum Blossom Sword Saint's era, but that was a different matter. There had never been an official incident like this. At Mount Hua's darkest hour, an unprecedented event was unraveling before their eyes in this time of hardship. They were unable to focus on anything else. Hyunjong looked at Chung Myung, who was staring at the other sect. Confident. Hyunjong was more impressed by that dignified attitude than the victories he achieved. Just when was it? When was the last time that a member of Mount Hua could proudly stand against the Jongnam Sect? Was it ever possible for them to stand tall? Oh, my ancestors. Hyunjong's eyes kept watering. As Mount Hua's sect leader, he knew that he needed to remain calm and shouldn't show such emotions. However, the passion rising from his heart was overwhelming. Sect leader, don't say anything. Hyunjong shook his head at Hyunsang's call. For now, let's wait and see what more he can show to us. Everyone held their breath and focused on Chung Myung's every move. Maybe today. A hopeful light that he had never seen before emerged in Hyunjong's eyes. Maybe the fate of Mount Hua will change. Strange. The gazes that pierced him, the feeling of his toes touching the floor, the wooden sword in his hand, all of that was different from usual. Jin-gum-ryung stepped on stage feeling a burden that was unfamiliar to him. Strange. Jin-gum-ryung felt it. This wasn't the sort of gaze that normally poured onto him. Jin-gum-ryung had already received looks of anticipation and excitement. Right. He was a valiant martial artist that carried the future of the sect. Those who saw him always looked at him with pride and expectation. This was the first time he received such looks of anxiety and concern. Why? Why are they looking at me like that? Jin-gum-ryung raised his head and saw the figure of Chung Myung looking back at him. Right, because of him. It was incomprehensible, but something was raging inside him. Jin-gum-ryung worked hard all his life to get to where he stood now. He strove to have his potential recognized and consistently lived up to the extraordinary expectations of those around him. Naturally, he began to be praised for his efforts. He was a man that might someday become the sect leader of the Jongnam Sect. It was the recognition and expectations he earned throughout his life. But in less than an hour, it all turned into concern and worry. Am I that unreliable? To the extent that they were worried he couldn't handle a single child from a fallen sect. A wave of cold and heavy anger swept through Jin-gum-ryung's body. He stared intently into Chung Myung's eyes. I didn't like him from the start. That arrogant face, the pretentious attitude, and the sharpness of his gaze. Above all else, Chung Myung despised how arrogantly he behaved. Even when Chung Myung was face to face with Chung Myung, it felt as though he was looking down on the Jungnam sect. Chung Myung took a deep breath and began to speak with an emotionless voice. Should I give you a compliment? I don't need that. Chung Myung shrugged his shoulders. It's not like I did anything great. Chung Myung looked at the child with cold eyes. You dare ignore the Jungnam sect. Ignore? Chung Myung chuckled. It isn't a matter of ignoring you. There's no reason to be proud of bullying the weak. Annoying. Every single word. You. Chung Myung stopped himself as he was about to speak before sighing and shaking his head. No, you don't need to be humble. Your skills are enough. Any humility from you will upset me. I admit it. Your strength has earned you the right to be arrogant. Just the fact that you defeated 9 of us is shocking. You will be recognized as a once-in-a-lifetime genius. Chung Myung narrowed his eyes. Shh! Chung Myung drew his wooden sword and aimed it at Chung Myung. Do you know what your misfortune is? Well, you were born during the same time as me. Chung Myung had a subtle smile while Chung Myung stared at him and continued. As a result of that misfortune, you will always stare at my back, unable to overcome the difference between us. You'll chase after my shadow for the rest of your life. Chung Myung grinned widely. It's good to be so confident. I'm not done yet. Chung Myung spoke coldly. If you hadn't chosen Mount Hua, you might have been able to overcome your misfortune. If you chose the Jungnam sect instead of Mount Hua, you might have had the opportunity to surpass me. Really? You think so? I do. Chung Myung cleared his breath and continued. Mount Hua is still tied down by the past. Its disciples desperately struggle to recover their lost martial arts and recreate their former glory. But not the Jungnam sect. Without lingering on ancient history, we invent a new system and achieve a better future. Chung Myung spoke as if making a declaration. That's why Mount Hua will never be able to catch up with the Jungnam sect. Wah! Huh! Chung Myung exclaimed in admiration. He wanted to clap too. If someone other than the Jungnam sect said it, he might have slapped his sahyungs on the back of their heads. Look at them and learn something, you bastards! Chung Myung may have shouted that. Unfortunately, the future that Chung Myung was talking about was achieved by stealing Mount Hua's martial arts. What should I do? 2 things were necessary to bring the truth to light. The first was acknowledging the truth, and the second was having the power to carry through with that announcement. When the Jungnam sect began to study the martial arts they stole from Mount Hua, Chung Myung was so furious that he was worried he would go insane. But does anger change anything? Realistically, there was no way Mount Hua could punish the Jungnam sect. If the issue was brought to the public, there would only be an outcry of voices demanding that they prove the Jungnam sect was actually learning the Plum Blossom Sword technique. Even if Mount Hua restored and displayed the true technique, the Jungnam sect would claim that they had been the ones that had their techniques copied and stolen. The weak Mount Hua had no choice but to suffer. Why? They simply didn't have enough power. Martial arts are a sensitive subject. Those who leak their secret techniques would pay with their lives, and those who steal them from others should be prepared for an all-out war. But Mount Hua cannot punish the Jungnam sect. The moment they raise the issue, the Jungnam sect will wage war on Mount Hua, and no one in the world could help them then. No one will risk their lives to defend the collapsing sect. So, Chung Myung stayed patient until this moment. He suppressed his boiling anger and endured his urge to charge into the Jungnam sect and slaughter them all for this moment alone. A gruesome smile spread across his face. The future of the Jungnam sect. That is a good thing to say. Chung Myung smiled at Chung Myung. Right. Chung Myung also thought about the Jungnam sect's future a lot. What to do with their future. Chung Myung left one seed in the Jungnam sect a little while ago. It was unknown if the seed would grow or not, but it served its purpose. So, he would no longer act as a third-class disciple from Mount Hua from this moment on. He would be acting as Chung Myung, the Plum Blossom Sword Saint, to those filthy people who ripped them off after they showed grace. That future, Chung Myung raised his sword. I'll present it to you as a gift. Right, it'll be a gift that you will never forget for the rest of your life, so you better keep your eyes open. Jin Gum-ryung looked at him, unable to understand, but Chung Myung smiled. The perfect gift, like a curse, restoring Mount Hua and destroying the current Jungnam sect wouldn't be enough to relieve Chung Myung's anger. He was about to cut off the Jungnam sect's future forever. You covet the sword of Mount Hua? Chung Myung smiled and laughed like a wolf, pacing his prey. Then receive it properly. I will show it to you, so don't forget it. Chung Myung tightly grasped his sword. Get away! Sasuk! Baekchun Sahyung! Mount Hua's disciple couldn't breathe as they looked at the center of the arena, but were startled when a voice came from behind. Baekchun staggered his way inside. Sahyung, are you alright? Listening to the questions pouring in, Baekchun simply waved his hand and walked ahead. Seeing this, Baeksang shouted, Chair! Get a chair! Yes, Sasuk! One of the third-class disciples hurriedly brought a chair for Baekchun. However, Baekchun only stared at Chung Myung and Jin Gum-ryung without even looking at the chair. I need to see this. As soon as he opened his eyes, he heard that Chung Myung had 9 straight wins. It was impossible for him to remain lying down after hearing that. Even if his body was shattered, he needed to be there to cheer for Chung Myung. Jin Gum-ryung and Chung Myung, 2 people that held a special meaning to him, were facing one another. Win, Chung Myung. Baekchun's earnest eyes shone with a desperate light. Swish, swish. Both Chung Myung and Jin Gum-ryung's swords began to move with a low sound. Whatever the outcome may be, the results of this battle would ring throughout the land and echo across the world. Mount Hua's disciples opened their eyes wide. They refused to miss even a single moment of this historic battle. Chapter 109. Elder, will Sahyung win? Seeing the elder tightly biting his lips, the disciple asked cautiously. Sama-seung parted his lips to answer as a stream of blood trickled down his chin. Will he win? It was an absurd question. He has to win, no matter what. If that monster's wings aren't broken today, then he would continue to soar further into the sky. Once that monster ascends, no one will ever be able to catch up. From that moment on, that monster would become a dragon. This might be the last chance. It might be the worst-case scenario, but Sama-seung hadn't given up hope. It'll be possible for Jin Gum-ryung. Although he was also a second-class disciple, Sama-seung had faith in him. Jin Gum-ryung's abilities stood far above the others. Although Sama-seung had spoken harshly to him, he firmly believed that Jin Gum-ryung could stand among the best in the world with enough luck. In other words, if Jin Gum-ryung cannot defeat that child, then no one in this world within that age range would be able to stop Chung Myung. In other words, if Chung Myung defeats Jin Gum-ryung today, then Chung Myung will naturally take his place as the strongest in his generation. That outcome was unacceptable. We should have stopped him sooner. Even if they had been criticized, Mount Hua should have been exterminated before it came to this. This was the result of them not destroying Mount Hua properly. Damn those Mount Hua bastards. Sama-seung glared at them. He could not allow history to remember this day as the Jungnam sect's disgrace. Never. At that moment, Jin Gum-ryung's sword began to bloom like a fantasy. Sama-seung clenched his fist as he watched the 12-movement snow flower sword technique unfold perfectly. This sword will take your breath away. Chung Myung looked at the sword. Similar. The movement was copied really well. The splendor, the beauty of a single flower as if it was alive and breathing, and a keen fatal blow hidden behind the beauty. Truly, the 24-movement Plum Blossom Sword technique. It is different from what Lee Song-baek performed. If Lee Song-baek's sword was merely an imitation of Mount Hua's technique, then Jin Gum-ryung's sword had an elegance that even Chung Myung might admire. Anyone bearing witness to such a fantastic sword would end up praising it. But the person in front of Jin Gum-ryung was Chung Myung, and he avoided the sword. Swish! Jin Gum-ryung's sword cut the hem of Chung Myung's robe. Swish! The tip of his hair was also cut. Swish! Soon, it brushed past Chung Myung's cheek. A red line appeared and a drop of blood trickled down. Chung Myung easily stepped back and raised a finger to wipe away the flowing blood before licking his finger. Bittersweet. You won't be able to defeat me by running away like that. Hearing Jin Gum-ryung's provocation, Chung Myung simply looked back at him in silence. Jin Gum-ryung's eyes revealed a sense of peace, and he appeared relaxed. Once upon a time, Mount Hua made a name for itself with a sword resembling a flower, right? But that's a story of the past. Now, even those legends will be buried beneath the Jungnam sect's new sword. The world will remember the tales of my sect and forget the sword of Mount Hua. Chung Myung quietly listened without responding. The ancestors of my sect created this technique to show the world that the Jungnam sect's swordsmanship will always be superior to Mount Hua's. I honestly believe that it was a meaningless act. What's the point in proving our superiority over a dying sect? However, Jin Gum-ryung spoke in a cold voice. There is a meaning in this sword technique, being the one that severs the last breath from Mount Hua. Come, I will end this dying legacy. Arrogant words, but it was a poignant talk. However, Chung Myung's reaction to this was different from what Jin Gum-ryung expected. Chung Myung covered his mouth and then began to lose himself in laughter. What are you doing? Chung Myung, who struggled to hold back his laughter, shook his hand with his head down. No, I'm trying, but I just can't hold it back anymore. Chung Myung smiled, revealed his teeth, and raised his sword at Jin Gum-ryung. I enjoyed the show. That act, well, it's more like a clown. Clown? Right, I enjoyed that clumsy impersonation. Even I can do it if it's only at that level. Jin Gum-ryung's face was distorted. He gnashed his teeth and his forehead crumpled. How dare you compare my sword to a mimicry? Don't get me wrong, it isn't like I'm looking down on you. Rather, it's the sword technique. Or perhaps it's the Jungnam sect who invented the technique that I'm looking down on. Jin Gum-ryung glared at Chung Myung, yet Chung Myung didn't back down. You don't need to glare at me like that. I'm going to give you a gift. I'll fill the void in that sword technique. It would be better for you to think about how you can escape with your body intact. I don't think that's something that a person who could barely touch their opponent should say. Jin Gum-ryung flinched. The 12-movement snowflower sword technique. The opponent shouldn't be able to distinguish between genuine strikes and illusory falsehoods. So wouldn't it be impossible for Chung Myung to avoid it? Jin Gum-ryung's knuckles turned white as he clenched his sword. Chung Myung wouldn't be able to survive once this technique was displayed, and Mount Hua wouldn't dare to ask Jin Gum-ryung to pay for his actions either. If they pressed charges, they would have to deal with the entire Jungnam sect. In the end, the strong dominates the weak. The weak may complain about injustice, but they can never punish the strong, an absolute law that can never be changed. However, Chung Myung brutally interrupted Jin Gum-ryung. I will ask you one thing. It was an unfamiliar tone. Just what is that sword? What do you mean? No, don't bother. That's enough. Chung Myung shook his head. It meant that he meant nothing. Chung Myung suppressed his true intention and spoke with a smirk in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear. That's a pretty good imitation, but it won't be enough. Mount Hua's sword is faster, sharper, and more dazzling. Everyone certainly heard that declaration. With this, the Jungnam sect would be unable to escape from the curse. Even now, you've got a big mouth. If you find a way to kill my mouth, let me know. Anyway, you're the one that's been doing all the talking for a while. Jin Gum-ryung moved his sword, deciding not to exchange words anymore. He was going to fight it out and not talk. One win. Just one win. His sword was splendid, and swiftly traversed through the air. The ki, emanating from the sword, began to form vivid flower patterns. One win, and another win in a different aspect. Soon, the flowers created by Chung Myung began to cover the area. As beautiful as can be, yet equally as dangerous. You will die by this sword. 12 movement snow flower sword technique. Chung Myung displayed the perfect version of this technique, the snow flower full heaven. The flower that dyed the world in white began to wrap around Chung Myung as if wanting to tear his body to shreds. Chung Myung! Screams erupted from all around. The disciples of Mount Hua, who were silently watching as if possessed, jumped up from their seats at once. They knew just how dangerous that sword could be. They didn't want to have to be there to know. Just looking at it from afar was enough to make goosebumps rise and their hearts skip a beat. Chung Myung, whose strength always instilled confidence and faith in them, suddenly seemed to have fallen into a dangerous situation where his survival was uncertain. Yunjong clasped his hands in front of his chest without realizing it. Heavenly God! Chung Myung's sword was so fierce that they worried for the safety of the monster like Chung Myung. It seemed like no one could survive in that storm of snowflowers. Even Baekchun was screaming for Chung Myung. All but just one. Yu Yisol bit her lip as she looked at the scene without much agitation. However, a single question crossed her mind. That's a sight she has seen before. Perhaps it was something familiar too. Something she'd seen recently. But different. Something felt different. This sword wasn't too different from what she knew. However, it didn't give that same feeling of her soul being sucked in like Chung Myung's sword. What was different? Yu Yisol turned her sights to Chung Myung. He would be the one to tell them what was different. Chung Myung had a subtle expression as he looked at the waves of flowers around. This is another kind of experience. It was different from when he was with his Sahyungs. It was rare to feel true killing intent from his Sahyungs. This might be how those demonic bastards felt when they faced the 24th movement Plum Blossom Sword technique. Maybe a little different. Chung Myung felt no threat, no pressure at all from this technique. Why? This is just a shell. Exactly, the shell of a failed sword. A technique begins with an idea, then a vision for how it will be displayed. Once the vision is formed, it must be granted substance. A sword that's given substance can be taught and learned. A sword that goes further than that can finally be called one with the Tao. But this sword was empty. The idea and vision formed the shell of the sword, but there was no substance or deeper meaning. It could never be a true sword technique. This sword was nothing but a copy of Mount Hua's sword, a shell with no opportunity for growth. This all happened because of a long-time misunderstanding. The Plum Blossom Sword technique makes flowers bloom? That is wrong in two ways. 1. Chung Myung began to move his sword slowly. The disciples of Mount Hua recognized it right away. The 7 Sages sword. The disciples all knew that this technique was recently brought back to the sect, but it seemed like a weak choice against the Jongnam sect's technique. At that time, Chung Myung mumbled to himself, "It isn't the Plum Blossom Sword technique that makes the flowers bloom. Flowers don't just bloom in dense forests. Even a single plum tree on a cliff can make flowers bloom." Whether it was the Plum Blossom or 7 Sages sword technique, it wasn't the technique that made the flowers bloom, but the disciple who held the sword. It was then a faint flower bloomed at the tip of Chung Myung's sword. A single red flower bloomed amidst the sword aura of the 12 movement snow flower sword technique, which seemingly colored the world white. It looked like a single snow blossom blooming on a snowy mountain. Snow plum blossoms bloom alone in the winter when the flower turns dry, and it gives off a stronger fragrance than others. Chung Myung's single plum blossom gradually multiplied and soon covered the white world with red plum blossoms, like snow plums blossoming on a snow-capped Mount Hua. Everyone witnessing this event was mesmerized. It was too beautiful to be swordsmanship and too majestic to be a man-made scene. This is an illusion. Time stopped. In that frozen moment, Only the plum blossoms that bloomed at that moment continued to release a scent so strong that they captivated the audience's senses. Chapter 110. This. Chung Myung saw the tinge of red blooming within the white world he'd created. A feeble light, like a drop of blood that fell on a pure white snowfield. It was nothing more than a tiny dot that seemed fragile, yet radiantly shone red. This red dot soon vividly took on the form of a plum blossom. One blossom, then another. In an instant, plum blossoms began to blend into Chung Myung's technique and burned it away. Just as snow melts in the blazing spring sun, the remnants of Chung Myung's technique melted away wherever the red plum blossoms bloomed. Plum blossoms. It was said that Mount Hua could no longer make plum blossoms bloom. That was why everyone assumed that Mount Hua would be unable to revive again. The plum blossom is the symbol of Mount Hua, no matter what anyone says. If Mount Hua cannot make the plum blossoms bloom, they could never recapture their former glory. But at this moment, the plum blossoms that had vanished from Mount Hua's history had begun to bloom again, even more vividly and colorful. Chung Myung couldn't believe it. He didn't doubt that Chung Myung's sword could give rise to the plum blossoms. That wasn't what Chung Myung failed to understand. He couldn't believe that the snow flowers he desperately bloomed were melting into Mount Hua's plum blossoms. Why? The 12-movement snowflower sword technique. This technique contained the last 100 years of the Jungnam sect's efforts. Wasn't this sword art supposed to culminate the essence of all Jungnam's techniques and show their dedication to development? Even if the legendary Plum Blossom Sword was reproduced, the sword of the Jungnam sect must be more advanced. It was impossible that their technique would lose to a relic of the older generations. But why is this happening? Melting away, tearing it apart. The moment the pure white flowers Chung Myung created touched Chung Myung's red plum blossoms, they collapsed as if they had never existed at all. Why? Chung Myung's eyes began to tremble. He couldn't display his sword any more perfect than this. It was a sword that unfolded perfectly, to the point that perfection itself seemed inadequate to describe it. So why couldn't that shabby plum blossom be defeated? Crushed. 12-movement snowflower sword. It was broken. The sword of the Jungnam sect. Collapsing. Their pride. Everything Chung Myung had built up till now was scattered by the red plum blossoms. Why? Chung Myung screamed. Chung Myung swung his sword with a half-hearted look in his eyes. A stream of red plum blossoms trailed from the tip of his sword. The flowers, following Chung Myung's sword, collapsed without any effort. A shell. Just a shell. No, an imitation of a shell. Everyone misunderstands Mount Hua's sword. Even the disciples of Mount Hua misunderstand it. The Plum Blossom Sword technique. No, the sword of Mount Hua is a sword that faithfully reproduces the color and beauty of the plum blossoms. People misunderstand and assume that Mount Hua's sword is judged by how beautiful and sophisticated the plum blossoms are. But is that all? Mount Hua is a Taoist sect. All of Mount Hua's sword techniques walk the path of Tao. The Wudang sect considered Tai Chi as their source. The Diankang sect considered the sun as their source. The Gongdong sect considered the 5 elements as their source. Every Taoist sect in the world resembled a form of nature, and their ultimate goal is to realize the Tao in their body. But Mount Hua is different. Mount Hua only pursues plum blossoms with their sword. When the sword of the Wudang sect reaches its peak, they feel like they have attained their source. Ching Cheng's sword becomes a blazing sun. The Gongdong sect harnesses the power of the 5 elements in their sword. However, Mount Hua has plum blossoms and plum blossoms alone. This made Mount Hua different from others. It is a sect that feverishly pursues glorious and beautiful techniques. But was that all? Did Mount Hua's sword only pursue the image of the plum blossom? Of course not. Everyone misunderstood. Chung Myung finally understood. After swinging the sword again and again, making plum blossoms bloom, and spending his entire life with Mount Hua's sword, he managed to climb to a height that no one else had ever reached. What Mount Hua strove to reproduce wasn't the plum blossom. Mount Hua didn't imitate the plum blossom. Mount Hua's sword makes plum blossoms bloom. It isn't the plum blossom. It was the blooming. Blooming. The conception of life. The fruit of patience finally blooms after persevering through a long winter. Since the plum blossoms are in full bloom on Mount Hua, they were chosen to represent the ability. But their sword can give birth to new life. So what does it matter which flower they choose to produce? The essence of Mount Hua's sword is blooming. Those who become blinded by the splendor of the plum blossoms and sharpen their swords in pursuit of that image will never reach the sect's true essence. If one can understand that Mount Hua wasn't pursuing the plum blossoms, but blooming. Right. Once they reached the level of Chung Myung, there was no need to distinguish between techniques. Even if it was a flower that wasn't the plum blossom, even if it wasn't the 24-movement plum blossom sword technique, whether it was the 12-movement snowflower sword or the falling flower sword, they could make the plum blossoms bloom. That was the true meaning of Mount Hua's sword. Those who live under the name of Mount Hua need to bear this in their hearts. Those who fail to understand this and simply pursue the dazzling sword they see will lose their light and forever wander, unable to reach the peak. Right, like Chung Myung. And just like his ancestors who created that sword technique, Chung Myung stared, mesmerized by Chung Myung. Look clearly. How your sword collapses. Human memory works mysteriously. The image of the Jungnam Sect's technique being broken by Chung Myung's more splendid and vivid sword in this conference would be engraved into their memories forever. Every time they swing their swords, they will remember this sight. Whenever they train, they will try to imitate what they have seen. In the end, the strength they believed in and depended upon will not help them escape from this curse. Flashier and even more extraordinary, but there is nothing at the end. All that exists for them is emptiness. The more they pursue splendor, the more the Jungnam Sect will lose their sword and fall deeper into the mire. Even if those they trusted betray you, even if they lost the sword techniques that were the center of their sect, even if an enemy pushes into the heart of their sect, Mount Hua will never disappear. As long as the spirit of Mount Hua remains what they seek, then just as the plum blossoms endure the harsh winter and bloom again, Mount Hua will once again make its name in the world. But what if the Jungnam Sect lost their techniques? What if they lose the spirit they once pursued? What if they were betrayed by their own ideas? Even if they haven't suffered a decline, the sect would soon collapse. Now, Chung Myung's sword will serve as poison for these men and become a curse that will bind their futures. Look, clearly, what you tried to steal, what you wanted so much. I will show you. This would become eternal shackles that will serve as Chung Myung's revenge for what the Jungnam Sect did to Mount Hua. Chung Myung's sword gracefully flew across the sky. From the tip of the sword, small plum blossoms bloomed. First one, and then another. The plum blossoms constantly bloomed. A flower that radiated life erupted into the world. The martial arts are divided into yin and yang, and Tai Chi is divided into 5 elements. The 5 elements make up the world, and within that world, life is born. After all, the world is an endless cycle of decay and rebirth. In this blooming, there is a path that the ancestors of Mount Hua tried to reach. Mount Hua's disciples entered Chung Myung's sight. Seeing them mesmerized by Mount Hua's sword evoked a strange sense of sorrow within Chung Myung. This is also my atonement. What he should have done, but couldn't. So look at this now. This was what Mount Hua ended up losing. This was where these disciples would need to climb one day. Ah! Hyunjong exclaimed at what he saw. He didn't know why he felt this way. The scene before his eyes had touched his heart. Plum blossoms were fully blooming once again. The plum blossoms that were out of season were suddenly blooming all around the bleak Mount Hua. And in that place, there was a spring that never seemed to come. A spring that never came to Mount Hua, even as the seasons changed. Spring had never come, even when a young boy grew into a healthy young man. When that young man grew into an old man whose shoulders were crushed under the weight of responsibility, he still waited for the spring to arrive as his hair turned white and his body withered. Finally, a spring that he had never seen, despite the long wait, had finally arrived. Tears welled up in Hyunjong's eyes. Right here, the Mount Hua he longed to see, the long-awaited sword of Mount Hua. It was right here. Hyunjong smiled. The tears didn't stop, but Hyunjong smiled. Mount Hua. Mount Hua was still here. After enduring and enduring all these harsh years, flowers were finally blooming. Mount Hua didn't disappear. Feeding his life, perseverance, and patience, the plum blossom finally bloomed after 100 years and disappeared. Chung Myung's beautiful technique had disappeared like fantasy. The cold and bitter snowflowers were pushed away by the warm wind, and plum blossoms filled the gaps left behind, blossoming again and again. The blooming red plum blossoms filled Chung Myung's vision. A sea of plum blossoms, a forest of plum blossoms with no end. This is Mount Hua? The sword of Mount Hua. Mount Hua's sword, the sword that the elders of the Jungnam sect feared so much and tried to recreate. Only now could Chung Myung understand why his elders were so afraid of Mount Hua. Something about this sword didn't exist in the Jungnam sect. This sword was unique to Mount Hua and could not be attained by others. The wind blew, and the plum blossoms began to flow together in unison. The entire world seemed to be filled with them. The sight of countless petals soaring at once was spectacular. Beautiful. Chung Myung was mesmerized and lost himself in the scene. Even though he understood his situation, he could not help but be entranced at the sight of the plum blossoms fluttering in front of him. A sight that didn't seem to belong to the real world. His soul felt as if it was being sucked in. What's the difference? Why couldn't he create this splendor? Why wasn't his sword so beautiful? Why? The plum blossoms didn't answer him. They simply covered the world, gently, splendidly, and majestically, and capturing a scene that he would eternally be unable to forget. A plum leaf softly descended onto Chung Myung's forehead, and silently it sank down.